Welcome to the opening plenary of Platypus's 17th International Convention. What is neoliberalism? For those unfamiliar with Platypus, the Platypus Affiliated Society organizes reading groups, public fora, research, and journalism focused on the problems and tasks inherited from the old 1920s and 30s, new 1960s to 70s, post-political 1980s to 90s, and now Millennial Left, for the politics of for possibilities of emancipatory politics today. So I'm first going to read the panel prompt, and then introduce the panelists, and then briefly sketch the panel format. Okay. This is the following prompt for what is neoliberalism. The apparent crack-up of the global political order over the last 25 years formed the backdrop for the radicalization of a new generation, the Millennials, who turned to the left in an attempt to understand capitalism anew and exploit its crisis in order to change it. We might trace their conception of the moment's political possibilities through its concrete manifestations, in the anti-imperialism of the Iraq War protests, the anti-globalization discontents resurfacing internationally in Occupy, and the turn to neo-social democratic organizations following the failure of prefigurative politics. Looking back at the first quarter of the 21st century, one might ask why the Millennial Left may have missed the opportunity to intervene in the transformation of capitalism with a politics of its own. The articulation of a post-neoliberal politics in Trump's second term seems to suggest the millennials' misrecognition of neoliberalism in its crisis for its reconsolidation. So Platypus asks, what was neoliberalism? What did it mean for the left? In particular, questions posed to the panelists are as follows. Is Marxism, or the term capitalism, still useful for the left to understand and change our world today? How will the next regime of capital accumulation, quote from David Harvey, be different from neoliberalism? How will it be the same? How will we understand this in terms of political realignment? And how might the Millennial Left been the last offenders of neoliberalism, in the words of Chris Catrone? So I'm now going to introduce the panelists in the order they'll be speaking. First, Panelist is a member of the Platypus Affiliated Society, an intellectual historian at the University of Chicago. Michael Kaizen is an American historian and professor at Georgetown University, as well as the editor emeritus of Dissent magazine. Jamie Merchant is an economist and member of the Independent Labor Club, as well as the author of Endgame. Benjamin Studebaker is a political theorist with a PhD in politics and international studies from the University of Cambridge. So the panel format, each of the four speakers will have 12 to 13 minutes each for their opening remarks, and then which will be followed by 5-minute responses, and then the rest of the time will be for the audience Q&A. Pam, if you would like to start.
Okay. Hear me? In 2008, so early years of Platypus, we co-sponsored a talk by Naomi Klein, Disaster Capitalism, Milton Friedman and the Chicago Boys. Klein presented on her new book, The Shock Doctrine. We turned the event into an opportunity to teach by printing a response in the pages of the Platypus Review, which also included an account of Platypus questions from the audience. Klein's book provided a history of neoliberalism, placing the origin of what she called disaster capitalism in Latin America in the 1970s. Chile was the first country to undergo economic shock treatment, Milton Friedman's term, from 1973 onwards. Klein argued that the coup that overthrew the democratic leftist president Salvador Allende and established the General Pinochet military dictatorship was a necessary political intervention for the implementation of the Chicago Boys' economic policies. These, she argued, could only be introduced at the barrel of a gun. Friedman's anti-Keynesian economic policy advocacy depended thus upon the very power of the Fordist national state against whose unfreedom he railed against. So this framing by Klein presented an antinomy between the undemocratic and authoritarian neoliberals against the democratic character of the anti-neoliberal resistance, which she located among the populist left of Latin America. She celebrated the democratic ethos of the Venezuelan president Hugo Chavez, running on a platform of 21st century socialism, whom she identified as among the staunchest opponents of neoliberal economics, winning election after election. This didn't age well. But this historical account is partial and distorting. Neoliberalism was ushered in by democratic political action as well. Elections that put Thatcher and Reagan into power, who attended to the prolonged crisis of the global New Deal. The presidency of Barack Obama, during the last chapter of the neoliberal regime, was also the result of the jubilant democratic election of the first Black president of the United States, where many who had been in the ranks of the anti-war movement, so my fellow millennial leftists, campaigned on his behalf. Under Obama's tenure, capitalism had to be saved from itself. As Chris Catrone wrote it back in 2017, after the first Trump election, capitalism has continued and will continue through political revolutions. In the Q&A at the Klein event, Platypus asked, "What is to be done? That is politically on the left." And she responded in an intentionally provocative way that one thing could be to nationalize the oil industry, which she understood as part of her greater advocacy of a New Deal. A call for Keynesian, Fordist, and welfare state social security reforms, an idea which was getting a renewed hearing among the new generation of leftists who would become the Millennial Left. And here we are, once again. As the anti-war movement wrapped up in the 2008 election of Obama, there was a return to the anti-neoliberal left, harking back to the anti-globalization movement of the 1990s. So that was Naomi Klein's moment, Seattle, 1999. The neo-anarchists had formulated a post-left horizontal practice that substituted reform or revolution with resistance. During Occupy, this presented itself as the insurrection. In the account by Saul Newman, a Lacanian anarchist who spoke at a Platypus panel in London, the insurrection was not the revolution because it was post-class and post-party. Instead, it brought together new forms of subjectivity through rhizomatic autonomous spaces so as to create novel forms of association. On this, David Graeber, also on the panel, and Saul Newman found common agreement. This post-left conception of political agency sure does leave a lot to be desired, but an outright dismissal is lazy. Taken into conversation with an older generation of Marxists, like fellow panelist Hillel Tickton, Newman and Graeber's arguments captured an important problem, albeit they captured it negatively. Tickton's dismissal of the post-left imagination was curt. As long as there are people who sell their labor power, there is a working class. For Tickton, as well as for the international Bolshevik tendency members in the audience, who also rejected the post-left vision of reality, neoliberal capitalist society was a continuation of the class struggle under a different name. The challenge by the post-leftists on the panel brought to light a static conception of a united working class as an objectively constituted sociological subject. Did one need a class perspective, after all, to understand neoliberal capitalist society? The occupiers at OWS didn't think so. These theoretical disagreements carried with them the hangover of political defeats, which the neo-anarchists and sectarian Marxists wanted to cast aside, but which remained obstacles in reality nonetheless. The defeat of 1917, the collapse of the international proletariat revolution, festered like a sore on the living. So much so that the left wanted to either move on by turning defeat into a victory, painting the collapse of working class political agency into an opportunity to play and experiment, Graeber, or downplay the disastrous effects of its historical rupture by carrying on the good fight. What side are you on, comrade? I hope the side of the working class. At Occupy, organized labor was represented at Sikoti Park by the presence of the AFL-CIO, who defended the encampments, much to the chagrin of the neo-anarchist, who could smell the opportunism a mile away. For these union leaders, Occupy offered an opportunity to put pressure on the Democrats. Okay, so is that all there was? Millennials could either end up in bed with the Democratic Party, led into its ranks by organized labor, or they could join the insurrection until the New York police broke up their drum circles. Is that it? Well, there was something else. There remained two stubborn, unanswered questions. First, about the nature of capitalist society and the reason for its perpetual state of instability. And second, about what political agency could transform it. In the shadow of the economic downturn, amidst global austerity protests, the occupiers directed most of their discontent against the government bailout. This protest was directed against Obama, a Democrat, who had signed on to infuse up to $700 billion, important correction, in taxpayer-backed loans into the US banking industry. As it turned out, Obama's Recovery Act, his version of a New Deal, didn't play out the way millennials had imagined. And their disappointment with the course of the recovery presented an opportunity, we thought, to reflect on the nature of capitalism and potentially Marxism, perhaps even in a more direct way than the preceding anti-war years. In the wake of the Occupy movement, Platypus hosted an international series of panels, the radical interpretations of the present crisis. Occupy had declared the lines in the sand were between Wall Street versus Main Street. Finance capital was fictitious capital, argued Lauren Goldner from Insurgent Notes. The banks, he said, held the productive capacities of society hostage. David Harvey pushed back. Credit played a role in mitigating the crisis of profitability, while at the same time further exacerbating the problem, kicking the can down the road. Harvey offered that, quote, the crisis tendencies of capitalism are never really resolved, they're just moved around, from Argentina to Bolivia to Greece. And this problem poses great difficulties to organize on the left. This brought to mind what Pustone had argued in 2006, where he wrote, the left continued to operate through outmoded political models that fell behind new opportunities for internationalism in the post-Fordist world. This was a point that Walter Ben Michaels also raised in our panel when he said, the internationalization of neoliberalism with international corporations negotiating with global unions would make for unions and workers' organizations very different from anything we've had before, although these organizations were appropriately imagined in the international. But Harvey's politics were at odds with his own insight. Harvey embraced Keynesian reforms as a check on what he called the accumulation of social power and encouraged the creation of a New Deal. In a bizarre moment during the 2012 New York panel, which lives rent-free in my head, Harvey enthusiastically exclaimed, raspberries, oxidizable currency would make a better money form. It would prevent the accumulation of wealth and block the monopoly on social power. You see, Harvey clarified, Keynes' stamped money wasn't a bad idea. These banknotes would require weekly or monthly stamps in order to remain valid, which imposes a tax on accumulation. He looked at the audience and said, the revolution of the money form. There's a political project for you. Echoes of Proudhon entered the room. Paul Maddock Jr. piped up, when we're talking about the economic crises and responses, let's remember that what we're talking about here is people making decisions about how to save capitalism. And this is what conditions its renewal. This also, I thought, included the left's Popular Front, its coalition behind FDR's New Deal, to save capitalism from itself. Maddock continued, if the workers were to decide tomorrow collectively to withdraw their labor power, well then, the political questions posed in this economic crisis would be entirely different. Okay, so neoliberalism then, I thought, could not be understood as the continuation of the class struggle. The deregulation of financial institutions that occurred under Clinton in the 1990s found a hearing not only among the wealthy, but also among the many working and middle-class people who were left out of the prior Keynesian Fordist arrangement. Aren't Trump's reforms today getting a hearing among those who felt like Obama's bailout left them out of the economic recovery he promised, even if they ultimately hurt working people with its high prices? But what will the left do about that? When the Secretary of Treasury, Scott Bessent, said this week that Trump's tariffs are setting the stage for a, quote, long-term economic growth because we were on our way to a financial crisis, will the left denounce him as a fascist? In the same way that the left, the Communist Party back then, initially called FDR a fascist, and just as the New Left called Reagan a fascist when he was elected. Democracy versus fascism? Is that the problem of neoliberalism, like Klein suggested? Across these neoliberal panel discussions, there was an epochal sense of the problem of capitalism. Harvey, Maddock, and Ticton reached back into the 19th century to emphasize the ongoing instability of capitalism. Goldner and Maddock both highlighted the creative destruction of capital's dynamic, which marked its historical trends. Goldner agreed with Maddock, but dated back the start of this destructive phase to 1914. For those of us in the audience then reading Lenin and Kautsky in the Platypus reading group, the date 1914 was not only the start of World War I, but also the great betrayal of August 4th, the collapse of the Second International, the crisis of Marxism, the prelude to the defeat of the proletariat revolution. The collapse of working class politics had created the necessary political conditions for the social compromise between big labor and big government, in Harvey's words, which had held together the political arrangement of Fordism. 1914 to 1919 thus formed the prehistory of the new neoliberal arrangement. So perhaps there was something to what Ticton and the IBT were trying to preserve, albeit in the mummified image of class struggle, a placeholder for working class politics in the political party, an otherwise forgotten task buried under the apparent mechanisms of the market, finance, the money form, or technocratic expertise. After Occupy, the left's conversations consistently returned to a point that Alan Ackerwas made on a Platypus panel in 2014 in New York when he said that working class people needed to do what the workers did in Germany in the 1800s, build a mass party of the working class. One part of the Millennial Left, those who were not taken by the libidinal drives of the insurrection, ended up in the DSA and around the Jacobin milieu. They too thought there was something to this Second International history, which they wanted to recapture. This led to what Platypus marked as a neo-Kautskian turn in the post-Occupy period, wherein the self-identified millennial socialists asked themselves about the political party for the working class. But if you blinked, you may have missed it. We tried to capture this new political horizon in our 5th and 6th annual conventions, so 2013 and 2014. We had speakers from Joseph Schwartz, the DSA intellectual and mentor to the DSA rank and file, different members of Syriza, which Leo Panich at the time had characterized as the most promising anti-neoliberal party of the European political stage, as well as autonomists and critics of the left power, the title of our opening plenary in 2013. It was a brief window before accommodation, before the entire detritus of the 20th century traumatized the millennials into paralysis. Perhaps they too felt the way that Graeber felt when he was told by Ticton about the necessity of the political party. Looking at Greece, Graeber was exasperated. He said, "The problem is that there's way too much revolutionary leadership. 37 different parties, all of which hate each other. What's the point? 37 flavors of revolutionary Marxism and nothing to show for it." Leo Panich's support for the millennials' neo-social democratic turn, a move away from the necessity for the party, went against also his own insight about the reflection of his generation's failure, which had conditioned the confusion for the Gen X, like Graeber, and the Millennial Left. He admitted that while, quote, "it's necessary to point out the limitations of the political left in the various Trotskyist groups that tried to found new Leninist parties, at the same time, those who came out of '68 and moved into the social democratic parties were also engaged in a futile and limited project. In both cases, they attempted to sink roots into the class. It was true of Tony Benn and Corbyn, as it was of the Trotskyist industrial organizers. In neither case did that succeed. Our generation of socialists in that sense failed. The Millennial Left ran through this trajectory as well, but lies about it today. Sad. The turn away from the felt necessity of the party by the millennials was not just a matter of a lack of will, but a result of intellectual exhaustion, a turning away from the ghosts of the 19th and 20th centuries. It amounted to throwing one's hands in the air at the unanswered questions that filled our halls in those neoliberalism panels, kicking the can down the road to the next generation for answers, who is less equipped, less prepared to even formulate the questions, but still look to the millennials for answers, which is a shame because the problem is that my generation, the Millennial Left, has made a career out of repressing the important questions.
on? Yeah. Thanks for inviting me to this. I'm chagrined to admit I had not heard of Platypus affiliated societies before I was invited to speak here, so I probably should be in the audience instead of up here to learn. And also I'm obviously a bit older than pretty much everyone here. I first got involved in politics in a serious way almost exactly 60 years ago when I went to my first teach-in at Columbia University, and then my first anti-war march a couple weeks later in Washington, D.C. And I was active in Students for Democratic Society in the late 1960s. I won't do autobiography, that's boring. But I was asked actually to talk about the relationship of the American left to neoliberalism. So that's what I'm going to make a few comments about. I did write a book about 15 years ago or so, which is the history of the American left, called American Dreamers, controversial title probably, How the Left Changed the Nation. And the chapter on the 1950s to the early 80s, I titled, Not With My Life You Don't. Not With My Life You Don't, which was actually an anti-draft button which SDS put out in the mid-1960s, which I used to wear proudly on my jacket when I was in college. And this is both a liberatory slogan and also one that, as you can imagine, also helped to lead to, let us say, the right taking over that kind of slogan, that kind of vision of individual freedom. And that's part of what, of course, neoliberalism is about. Prizing individual freedom in the market and pretty much every part of life over more collective rights, more collective identities. And now I'm talking about primarily about the white new left, but I'm going to make comments about the black new left too. The two not to be completely separated, obviously. But the white new left was, I think, much more energized by restrictions on individual freedom by the state, specifically. More than restrictions, the tyranny of corporations and corporate power. And of course by the imperial war in Indochina, which was the major issue that united everybody on the left back then, from whatever ideological camp they might come from. More energized by these issues than by economic inequality in the United States. And really, labor unions, the labor movement, was seen by most people who left as having sold out to imperialism, having sold out to the Democratic Party, having sold out to this hegemonic force, and also having late 1940s jettisoned pro-communist unions, the CIO doing that in 1949, and it was not seen by most new leftists as a force for radical change at all. In fact, if anything, it was seen as part of the establishment. Now, that was less true, I think, for African-American radicals and left liberals. For them, racial inequality was inseparable from class inequality. They could not talk about the poor, because so many African-Americans were poor. If you read speeches by MLK Jr., the less well-known speeches, there's a collection of them, which is a speech he gave to unions, where he called for an interracial alliance within the unions to put pressure on those in power. But that was not something which actually a lot of people I knew back in the 60s, white radicals, knew much about. The king didn't even give these speeches, because he was seen primarily, of course, as the iconic king that the monument is built to on the wall. The one who gave the speech at the March of '63. Most people not thinking about the fact that that march was mostly paid for by the United Auto Workers. And it was a march for jobs and freedom, jobs being first. And so perception of most people who are in the New Left, I think, is, and the reasons they were active is, in retrospect, something which probably weakened the longer-term possibility of the New Left being connected to a real seriously class-conscious movement. Marshall Berman, who some of you might have read, a very fine theorist, a literary scholar, died several years ago, wrote, he has a famous book about Marxism, as you probably know, all that is solid melts into air. If you haven't read it, you should. He wrote about the New Left, of which he was part. He said, the New Left's complaint against democratic capitalism was not that it was too individualistic, but rather that it wasn't individualistic enough. It forced every individual into competitive and aggressive impasses, which prevented any individual feelings, needs, ideas, energies from being expressed. Berman also summarized in a pithy phrase how little most white New Leftists worry about the problems of the poor, and how much instead about the immorality of consumer society. I heard a lot more about commodity fetishism in the late 60s, people talking about Marx than I did about the exploitation of labor. The old left, Marshall wrote in a pithy phrase, protested the abundance of poverty, whereas the New Left was more concerned with the poverty of abundance. And the Point Huron statement, of course, the founding statement of SDS in 1962, writes a lot about alienation. It's very affected by people having read the economic philosophical manuscripts and by existentialism, very little based on material inequality and material exploitation. Michael Harrington, who wrote the revelatory book about how many Americans were still quite poor in the 1960s, The Other America, was a friendly critic of SDS back then, and not just because he thought the New Left was naive about communism, but it was really because he thought the New Left was not thinking about class in a serious way, not thinking about how to build a movement of working class people to make the United States a social democratic nation. He was not interested in revolution, but he was interested in making the United States more like Sweden. Though he was also involved very much in the Black Freedom movement. He was very, very close to King. And to be fair, the various Leninist sects, Progressive Labor Party, Socialist Workers' Party, Spartacist League, the 137, as you mentioned, but there were a lot back then. I was very critical of them back then. I thought they were too dogmatic, and I still think they were, but they did take class more seriously. They did want people to leave colleges like Harvard or wherever to school and work in factories, whether that was realistic or not is a question in terms of people's life and in terms of how good organizers people might be, but they did want people to proletarianize themselves. Their Maoist dogmatism didn't travel well, but they were right, I think, about when they criticized the individualistic ethos of those they opposed in the New Left. One reason why the New Left never had a durable organization of its own, and SDS was kind of like a meteor that fell to earth just 4 years after it began to soar. It was always much more associated with the anti-war movement than any other major issue at the time. It was always almost all white, because by 65, as you probably know, the Black Power movement was beginning to rise. And most Black radical activists didn't want white people in organizations anymore, and they had their own organizations to build. But SDS was a very much sort of loosey-goosey organization. Nobody believed how many members there were in it at any given time. Membership cards, sometimes people paid, sometimes they didn't. There was not a real sense of the need to build a collective organization, which after all, again, requires a certain acquiescence in not pressing one's individual desires and objections. One has to acquiesce to group decisions, and that's not something most people knew left, even though they paid obeisance to it and were very pro-Cuba, very pro-National Liberation Front, some of them very pro-China. They did not take seriously the fact that one has to build durable organizations if one's going to get anywhere. But it's, at the same time, I think it's important to say it was the the drive to secure the freedom of individuals, whether as part of groups, black, female, LGBT, Native American, Chicano, etc. There was a moral glue that did unify white new leftists and led, I argue in my book about the left, to its greatest accomplishments, I think, at least helping to bring about those accomplishments, like legal changes in civil rights, like the beginning of a new feminist movement, and for the first time really a mass movement of gay and lesbian people, and also a mass environmental movement. The new left was very much a part of that. If you wanted to do your own thing, as the phrase had it, more of the counterculture than the new left, then you had to make sure that authorities were not going to stop you from doing that. And that was the, you might say, consensual ideology of people generally on the new left, opposed to all manner of authorities, corporate, governmental, parental, et cetera, et cetera. And so the connection to neoliberalism here is probably obvious. And I should say, the new left and the counterculture were not the same thing, but also they can't be really truly separated from one another either. So it's not surprising, for example, that the Whole Earth Catalog, have you ever heard of the Whole Earth Catalog? Oh, you're not. Which is a very popular magazine of do-it-yourself technology. It started, personal computer clubs, people building their own computers. It was edited by a guy named Stuart Brand, who was you might say, a sort of creative anarchist. The Whole Earth Catalog was a big hit with leftists in the 60s as much as it was with people who wanted to just build their own computers and play early video games. But the connection to neoliberalism is there too, because one of its biggest fans in the Bay Area was a high school kid from the Bay Area named Steve Jobs. He praised the catalog as, quote, one of the Bibles of my generation. And in 1976, he forms Apple. And of course, the class nature of the new left, the white new left especially, matters here. At a time when fewer than 1/5 of Americans over 25 were college graduates, college students, as you know, were the base of the movement, though it wasn't just a college student movement, but it was primarily a college student movement, of course. And that was true, by the way, among black new leftists in the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, as well as it was with SDS. Even the Black Panther Party, which hailed the revolutionary potential of the lumpen proletariat, was founded by two guys in college, at Merritt College in Oakland, California. And they raised money for the organization, first by selling a little red book on the streets of Berkeley. Now this gets into a discussion we can have about the professional managerial class and about what degree people from SDS and from the Black Freedom Movement ended up becoming professionals of one kind or another, some academics, some lawyers, some just working for corporations trying to make them more humane. Gabe Weiner, who teaches here, wrote a great article about the PMC 7 years ago. Sorry?
2-minute warning.
Oh, sorry. Okay. I'll go quickly. But ironically, there was this one political party that did understand the continuing injuries of the working class, and that, at the time, and that, surprisingly, was the Democratic Party. Let me quickly just contrast the 68 Democratic platform with the SDS convention of 1968. At the 68 convention, Democrats here, of course, Democrats endorsed the closest thing to a social democratic platform in their history. It included proposals to extend the National Labor Relations Act to agricultural workers, do away with the provision in the Taft-Hartley law that allowed states to pass right-to-work laws, call for a big boost in federal financing for urban housing, a big increase in the minimum wage, aggressive environmental protection laws, congressional representation for the District of Columbia, and establish the right to health care. At the SDS convention, a couple months earlier, the delegates spent most of their time arguing whether you were for or against the Progressive Labor Party, the Maoist party at the time. There were no resolutions passed of any real meaning. Finally, one aspect of the connection between the New Left and the development of what we now call neoliberalism, I think can be connected to the thinking and strategy of the environmental movement, led by Ralph Nader and others. A fascinating book by a historian at Yale named Paul Sabin called Public Citizens, in which he argues that Nader's movement, the consumer movement, and the early environmental movement spent their time attacking the state primarily, attacking the state for having corrupt relationships with corporations, and brought suits against the state. All this helped to build the environmental movement, but in many ways, corporations were left sort of seen as parasites on the state, instead of the other way around. And so government power was in many ways delegitimized by Nader and those who worked with him. And so it led, I think, to a certain cynicism about what the state could do. But of course, neoliberalism attacked the powers of the state in its own way. But you could argue that power was, delegitimized in the minds of a lot of young activists on the left because of some of the things Nader and his folks were doing. So very quickly, how did the New Left help to foster neoliberalism? First, by promoting the vision of individual liberation from oppressive, self-serving institutions, and second, by failing to organize any effective or lasting institutions of their own. As Barry Rustin wrote in one of the most important essays by a leftist in the 1960s for Protest to Politics, said, the movement needed to move from protest to politics, but it never really did, at least not in its own name. Thank you.
Jamie, if you want to take it away.
Sure. So just a quick correction in the bio. I'm definitely not an economist, thank God. I'm just a guy who writes about political economy. I thought I would just talk a little bit directly about the what was neoliberalism question. And I think the first thing that stands out, or that stood out to me when I was thinking about reflecting on this particular question again, was, of course, the word liberalism. And what we were talking about for some years there was that this is some kind of new version of liberalism, right? And whether we think of that as like a rebirth or a renovation or some kind of like recuperation, it was supposed to be some kind of repetition. And historically, we can sort of begin to outline it as the reaction that began to take shape during the chaos of the 70s, during a global stagflationary crisis of that decade in which no one knew what was going on, like pretty much at every level of society, much like today, actually. And people were looking for answers. And it was in response to a lot of the class struggles that Michael was referring to in the student movement and in the old industrial working class, as those fights were picking up, as inflation was running rampant, as corporate profits were declining. The ruling class of this country and other countries began to cast around for some kind of response to the evident failure of what we could maybe call like the Keynesian managerial state that came about after the Second World War, and was supposed to have tamed the contradictions and crisis tendencies of capitalism through a kind of scientific style of management run by professional economists, right? And it was in response to the failure of that cohort of elites to have convincing answers to the crisis of the 70s that Milton Friedman and his colleagues sort of were the right people at the right time with what appeared eventually to be the right ideas to members or fractions of the ruling class who were sort of done with this whole playing nice with the unions and with the militant working class, and were sort of just ready to take the gloves off in the class war. And so that's the beginning of the corporate assault, right, on the organized working class that really kicks off. That really kicks off with Carter and Fed Chair Paul Volcker and the massive, what people sort of refer to as the Volcker shock, when he allowed interest rates of the Federal Reserve to reach like 30%, precipitating a devastating global crisis, particularly in the global south, from which many countries in the global south still have not recovered to this day. And that led to a very deep depression in this country, industrial depression, and the beginning of industrial outsourcing and deindustrialization, and in fact financialization, the complex sort of turn of capital towards investment in financial assets rather than productive activities that we sort of know by the shorthand of financialization. As we know, all of that sort of really gets going under Reagan and other sort of similar figures worldwide. And so neoliberalism had this sort of deregulatory edge to it, and it looked like it was rolling back state institutions, state structures, in order to make room for market structures, market institutions, and to open up new ways for capitalists of every kind, but especially finance capitalists, to make money hand over fist. And so it looked like for a while in the 80s and 90s that it was a kind of deregulatory push, a push for privatization, a push for smashing up the unions, for opening up more and more areas of collective and public life to the imperatives of the market, accompanied by this kind of this rhetoric of the freedom of the market and individual autonomy and individual choice, and all of those ideological accompaniments. But beginning around sometime post-Occupy, post-2008 crisis, maybe it has earlier roots, there was a sort of counter-narrative that began to take shape that saw neoliberalism more as a state-driven process. Markets/capital require strong states to construct the space for markets to exist institutionally and socially and politically, right? And so there was a lot of important writing about people like Friedrich Hayek and the Mount Pelerin Society and that whole shady group of people who were consciously developing the idea of neoliberalism as this militant new form of liberalism that had nothing to do with the old ideas, right, about just a non-active state allowing markets to function. Rather, it was more that the state took on an actively destructive and constructive role, right, to create the possibilities for markets and market-based class power to thrive. And so that sort of pushback against the earlier, more straightforward kind of understanding of it as this deregulatory and privatizing push began. And that was kind of the state of the discourse for some of the 2010s. And I think it relies on this basic opposition between state and market, right? Where you have markets and capital on one side and states and government on the other, and it's all about this kind of movement of forces back and forth between them. And it relies on this strict separation between politics and economics, right? But what I would argue, especially in light of the last 5 or 6 years, and just drawing on particular writers in the Marxist tradition, is that this is to misrecognize the fetishized appearances of capital for the thing itself. That both seeing the state as some sort of neutral vessel that, for instance, a populist left party can infiltrate and use to overthrow the rule of capital, for example, takes that fetishized appearance of the state as this neutral institution that doesn't have any sort of class rooting at face value. And likewise sees markets and economics as this sort of like technical realm in which you can intervene and mess around with in order to deliver the most optimum economic outcome. This would be like the Keynesian presupposition, right? And so I think really what was happening during the 80s and 90s and 2000s was a great reconcentration of capital on a global scale. The deindustrialization and the migration of production and the most industrially and technologically intensive forms of industrial manufacturing to certain parts of the world, largely Southeast Asia, but not entirely, the Pacific Rim, and the centralization of the ownership of capital in a financial form in the global north, particularly in this country, but not, again, not entirely. And so I think that transformation in the capital order or in the form of capitalist rule is what was happening during the years that we were talking a lot about what neoliberalism is and talking about how we're going to fight it and beat it and whatever. And I think ultimately, just to answer the question directly, neoliberalism was the mode of control of this, what I call elsewhere, like the planetary factory, right? This immense total process of production and distribution, transportation and exchange that links the productive core of the global economy to to elsewhere in the world, and particularly though transfers value from the labor forces that are exploited in other parts of the world into its financial form, and into the kind of through the value chains into the commodities, right? The high value added commodities that are marketed in the more affluent consumer markets of the world. And so I do agree with the prompt, the question that we were sort of presented with, which is like this past tense question, like what was neoliberalism? I think in some way it was the administrative mode of control of the planetary factory during that period of globalization and sort of high neoliberalism in the 90s and the 2000s and to some extent into the 2010s. But I think the really astonishing breakdown that we're seeing now and the sort of legitimation crises that we're seeing break out in a really virulent form all around the world for the old regimes that were kind of like the figureheads of the neoliberal years and their replacement by something else, right? Like what we have now, indicates that like that, just to draw on the metaphor once more, like the factory is breaking down, right? Like I would say like the rate of profit is declining. That's why there isn't enough investment. That's why states have to go into like ever larger magnitudes of debt just to like bribe capitalists to invest. That's what a lot of the industrial policy and like geopolitical, quote unquote, geopolitical conflict is about. It's about just which states can throw enough government money at capitalists to induce them to invest because it's not profitable enough to do otherwise.
Just a 3-minute warning.
And so I take that to mean that the factory is no longer productive, so to speak. It's not producing enough of an output or enough of a surplus to allow the countries and the capitalists of the global economy to grow together and to sustain some kind of broad legitimating ideology for capitalism as a whole. That it's this, as the elites used to discuss or think, that it's going to, through comparative advantage and through free trade and the free movement of capital, all boats will rise together in the sort of world of globalization. Trump is just throwing all that trash into the garbage bin and saying that it's just a struggle for power. And that's the pitch, right, that he's making, just straight up. And so, yeah, just to wrap it up, that's how I would interpret the question, what was neoliberalism?
All right. These days I write about legitimacy, but when I was a master's student here at University of Chicago in 2014, I wrote a lot about economic inequality. Immediately following the global economic crisis of 2008, economic inequality was a hot research area. Everyone in the academy recognized that it was one of the big issues. It ranked right up there with climate change and security studies. I was reading Larry Bartels, Carl Boyce, Jacob Hacker, Thomas Piketty, Carl Polanyi, and Jeffrey Winters. I'm 33 today. I was 22 back then. We're going to try to have a little chat with 22-year-old Benjamin. Maybe, if we're not too mean to him, we can get him to appear. Obviously, anytime I speak for 22-year-old Benjamin, I'm protecting him from you. The only way you can hear 22-year-old Benjamin is for me to let him speak in the way he speaks, even if it's not quite the way I speak anymore. The thing is, 22-year-old Benjamin is a dear old friend of mine. Without him, I wouldn't be here. So despite his limitations, I love him very much. I won't have you make fun of him. You have to promise not to, okay?
Yes.
22-year-old Benjamin, you there? I think I see him. You could trust these guys. They're not going to be mean. They promise. Really? I think they mean it. Okay, here he is. The title of my master's thesis is The Return of Depression Politics. My MA supervisor said this thesis deserves the highest grade he can possibly give it. So it must be pretty good. Plus, the MAPS program here at Chicago secures funded PhD offers for 90% of its graduates who choose to apply. So hopefully I'll get into a good PhD program next year. Here's the abstract. This paper argues that high levels of economic inequality pose a significant danger going forward to democratic political systems in developed countries. It shows that inequality has been rising in many of these countries through a process of disembedding, in which the economic system has been steadily modified to undo many of the Keynesian reforms enacted in the wake of the interwar period. As inequality rises and the frequency and severity of economic crises increases, history shows that the left will push for radical redistribution, while the right will grow increasingly authoritarian. This polarization eventually yields a political crisis in which a revolutionary, reformist, or authoritarian solution is chosen. While there are policies states could undertake to reverse the trend toward higher inequality and instability, there are structural obstacles that make it extremely difficult for these policies to be enacted in practice. Among these are voter myopia, voter ignorance, and political money. The necessary structural reforms that would be needed to remove these obstacles are themselves extremely difficult to enact because of the obstacles. Well, Benjamin, if I told many Democrats that you wrote this abstract in 2014, they'd think you were very wise indeed. They would tell you how you anticipated Bernie Sanders and Donald Trump. Indeed, if I were to write this up as a book, even today, I bet it would be very well received. Thank you, Benjamin. But I never wrote that book. And would you be astonished to hear that I intend never to write it, even though I could at any time? Why would you say that? Why would you betray me? Well, when I went to Cambridge, my supervisor, David Runciman, asked a great question. Sure, there are many ways in which the contemporary period is like the 1930s, but what about all the ways in which it's different? Despite the cuts to all the old Keynesian programs, we still don't see the kind of mass unemployment we saw in the 30s. While economic growth hasn't been strong since 2008, it has continued. Only 5% of Americans graduated from college when the war began. Now nearly 40% of Americans go through the university system. In the 30s, militaries relied upon large numbers of citizen conscripts, with large numbers of factory workers manufacturing enormous numbers of bullets and shells. But today, wars are increasingly fought from behind computer screens. While in the 30s, there were sharp reductions to global trade. Trade is roughly the same percent of global GDP today that it was in 2014 when you were around. There hasn't been any major disruption in capital mobility, and communism and fascism have been discredited. There appear to be no alternatives now. Without any disruption in capital mobility, how is anyone supposed to have a revolution? And without the threat of revolution, why would anyone consider reforms or authoritarianism? Indeed, why would anyone consider reforms or authoritarianism? The state doesn't face any serious internal threats, and yet everyone today is convinced that it does, and that you were right all along. That's crazy. People are stupid. Why are you still talking to them? Wait, you're not happy that your argument is triumphant all over the world? No, I don't care about the argument. I want to find a way to reduce economic inequality. I want my friends back home to have what they need to live better. I thought you said people were stupid. They are, but it's not their fault. They wouldn't be so stupid if they were living better. Now, there's something to that. And you thought the Keynesian programs would help them live better, didn't you? Yes, but in the 70s, those programs weren't enough. People are so profoundly stupid that even with a significant amount of social programs, they still can't think their way out of a paper bag. They overreacted to the stagflation and let themselves be deceived by right-wing think tanks, lobbyists, and political action committees. We have a decrepit society. You know, it didn't just begin in the 70s. As soon as the war ended, they started working hard to increase capital mobility. The General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade was signed in 1947. There were 6 rounds of GATT before the Tokyo round in 1973. There was already so much more trade and automation in the 70s than there had been in the 40s. It was already a whole different world by then. Yeah, they were too stupid even at the start. Keynesianism was never even properly tried. Well, doesn't that just go to show, even with capital mobility heavily disrupted by World War, and even with the Soviet Union lurking, there was a limit to the amount of reform that could be extracted? Democracy doesn't work. Plato is right about it. We need philosopher kings. They have to put us in charge, and we'll fix it. That's not going to happen. Look at these people. They're the ones who would have to be the philosopher kings. But most of them would rather live under a capitalist democracy than rule as kings. You just sound like a really cringe right-winger to them right now. You know that, right? Of course I know that. I'm the one who said you should stop talking to these people and go back to writing. But these are our readers. Who else is going to read us? If you wrote up my thesis, a lot of people would read us. But we wouldn't be telling the truth. No. And we wouldn't be doing any good. Certainly not. So what would be the point? Well, you could write a book about Plato and Marx. Maybe they'd understand that. I thought you said talking to them was a waste of time. It probably is, but at least that would be a good book. Anyway, these people want to know what you think about neoliberalism. That's what they're really here for. Neoliberalism. I only mentioned neoliberalism one time in my thesis. Here's what I said. In the modern context, classical and neoliberal doctrines of deregulation, capital mobility, free trade, and the like have acquired a conservative association. So if we follow what we said before, the effort to restore capital mobility began as soon as the war ended. So in that sense, the post-war era is an era of neoliberalism. Yes, I suppose I would have to agree with that. Indeed, in the post-war era, there was a neoclassical synthesis. There was an effort to diminish tensions between Keynesian and classically liberal approaches. We might think of this as an early, unconscious kind of proto-neoliberalism. I hadn't thought of that, but that's a fun idea. Then in the 70s, with the emergence of new classical and new Keynesian economics, we become conscious of a neoliberalism that is, in some sense, an alternative to the post-war era. But in fact, this alternative was already objectively in operation. We just reached the point at which it could be openly championed on its own terms without having to rely on a rhetorical appeal to Keynes. That makes sense. They still do Keynesianism in emergencies. Reagan did stimulus, just like Obama. Right, but it is a given that this stimulus will come alongside a high level of capital mobility. It will be used to defend capital mobility and not to qualify it or undermine it. But didn't you tell me earlier today, before we arrived, that there have been some tariffs lately? What are those about? Is capital mobility being reduced? Is neoliberalism ending? The president is using tariffs to try to change the way the global trade system works. And today, neoliberalism is a dirty word. Nobody wants to be associated with it. So is neoliberalism ending? Are you supporting this president? I have friends who think I should, but just like you, I've never voted for a Democrat or a Republican for president. Well, yeah, voting is stupid. But what do you say about it? About his policies? I say that he is continuing neoliberalism by alternative means. Like President Obama, he's concerned about the rise of China. He wants to execute Obama's pivot to Asia to contain China. To do this, he needs to drive businesses out of China, and he needs to increase our military capability. Obama tried to do this with a free trade agreement, the Trans-Pacific Partnership. The aim was to create business environments in other countries in East Asia so that businesses would have good alternatives. It included rich countries like Japan, Australia, New Zealand, and Canada, as well as developing countries like Chile, Peru, Vietnam, Malaysia, and Mexico. Even Singapore and Brunei got in on it. There were many countries that were going to benefit from this approach. But increasingly, neoliberalism is unpopular. The government had to appear more interested in bringing jobs back to the United States. So this president is taking a different approach. He's placing high tariffs on China, and he's threatening to place them on some of the allied states, including some of the states that signed on to the TPP. He's also looking to do more business with countries that weren't originally signatories, like India. This president was interested in doing all of this back in 2018, but it was disrupted by a global pandemic. Wait, there was a pandemic? Yes, everybody stayed at home, and the kids didn't go to school, and now everything is much dumber than it was when you were around. Good God. Yes, it only gets worse. Dad dies, and a couple years later, a tree falls on our house. That's horrible. Why didn't you tell me about any of this? Look, I'm sorry, I've been busy. We didn't get an academic job after the PhD finished. But you told me that you wrote a book. I did. I think it's a good book, but nobody cares. We'll talk about this later. You said the president's trying to increase our military capability. Yes, but he wants to do it without raising defense spending because he also wants to cut taxes. So he's trying to get the allies to do his defense spending for him. How does that work? Well, during the pandemic, the president lost the election. And wouldn't you believe it, Joe Biden became president. Isn't he like 1,000 years old? Yes, but the Democrats had really terrible young politicians, so they went with him. What happened with Biden? Well, during the Biden years, Russia invaded Ukraine. It's not clear that Biden wanted it to happen, but he didn't try very hard to prevent it either. And then Nord Stream 2 blew up. They blew up Nord Stream 2? The Europeans rely on the Russians for gas. Who would do such a thing? Well, according to the official narrative, Ukraine blew up the pipeline without informing the United States.
Sorry, Benjamin. 2 minutes.
Told you that this was going to go on too long. Anyway, did we punish them for undermining European security? No, we continued to support Ukraine, and the Europeans also continued to support Ukraine. All of this war spending has helped to fund the reshoring of many defense-related industries. Biden was very proud of this. He talked about it openly. But Biden wasn't able to get reelected, and the old president came back. What did he do this time? He threatened to stop supporting Ukraine. When he did that, the Europeans committed to spend much more on defense. And in the Middle East, he's been making aggressive noises at Iran to try to get the Arab states to spend more too. He's hoping to use Iran to get the Arabs to work with Israel to create a peace in Gaza. And now that he's back in, he's using much heavier tariffs than before. Some people think this is the end of neoliberalism, but I don't think the two administrations are very different at all. They both want what I call neoliberalism without China, an international system with a lot of capital mobility in which China gradually comes to play a smaller role. So if neoliberalism has been around since the war and it's going to be around for the foreseeable future, what's special about it? What makes it different from capitalism? Honestly, nothing really. It's a way of talking about the return of capitalism after the disruptions visited upon it by the world wars, the Bolshevik Revolution, and the Great Depression. If you're not careful, it can lead you to think that we've returned to a previous epoch, the 30s or 1917 or the Gilded Age or 1848, but we haven't returned to a previous period. We've just restarted capitalism in circumstances reshaped by those wars and their consequences. That restart has had its hiccups, but it continues. So what are they going to do about it? Wait for another world war? That would be stupid. Yes, it would. You willing to stick around for the Q&A if they ask you any questions? We'll see if they're nice.
Great remarks from all of our panelists. If we could go through in the same order as before, 5 minutes for each panelist for responses. Pam, would you like to start?
A couple of questions. Michael, you talked about kind of preconditions of neoliberalism already there in the New Left. And I wonder, we do some readings of the New Left in the reading group in Platypus, and there seemed to be a moment of political horizons that were much wider than simply a fight for individualism. One of the things that we read is a letter to the New Left by C. Wright Mills, where he's highlighting that Marxism became an affirmative ideology, the labor metaphysics of the working class, but that this doesn't mean throwing away the problem of capitalism, but rather thinking about that history anew. And I was wondering if you thought that you could periodize the New Left, or was it always just the case that they didn't think about the working class, they didn't think about the possibility of transforming capitalism? Was it just a smooth transition into neoliberalism? I think we're gonna do round, but just something I'm curious. And I wondered, Jamie, if this formulation of the planetary factory and the relationship to administrative control, if it was different in what ways from the way that Harvey conceptualizes the relationship between regimes of accumulation and the management, the political management. And is it the case then that you see no difference between the attempts to transform capitalism by social democrats and the early 20th century revolutionaries? Are they both mistaken in terms of having to grasp the state? Like, what's the state for the revolutionaries of the early 20th century, and what does it become for the social democrats? I'm not sure what to ask Benjamin. I guess I kind of wanted to know what you think we should do, and maybe that was later in the dialogue. But one thing that struck me was that you talked about the continuation between the previous administration and Trump as like neoliberalism without China. And I guess something that I found among the left in their articulation of post-Fordism is that, like Harvey mentions this, that it's the Fordist, it's the post-Fordist transition is done through the Fordist state. And so isn't it possible then that we're living through a period of transition that looks as if it's a kind of heightened neoliberalism, but it might bring about something new in the same way in which the Fordist state was used to bring about something new? I'll leave it there.
To answer your question, try to answer your question. I should have been more precise when I said about the New Left and capitalism. It wasn't that the New Left didn't think about capitalism, it was pro-capitalist, obviously. It was the analysis of capitalism as alienating as opposed to a source of inequality primarily. And in Mills's letter to the left, as I remember, I haven't read it in a little while, but he goes through the bourgeoisification of labor. He wrote an earlier book called New Men of Power, which was already seeing from his point of view that labor was becoming part of the established order. He wasn't completely wrong about that, but and so at the end of that letter, he basically says, we have to depend on a growing number of students, right, in order to bring about, something like radical change, and that even though now there's many more students than there were then, that itself, I think, was a dead end in terms of how to bring about any kind of radical change. It was important for students to be part of that, but the student movement was not going to be the agent of change the way working class organizations had been in many ways in Europe and the United States. My question for everybody, I'm not an economist. I don't read theoretical economics very much. But I'm curious what kind of politics in the United States today follows from your analyses, which I learned from. But I'll out myself here. I'm a left-wing Democrat, capital D, as well as small d. But I think all true Democrats with small d are on the left. But I don't know if I want to get into this, but we're obviously facing a radically reactionary government, which is well organized, which has been working for at least 4 years to do what they're doing, and intellectuals on the left like us, don't have a real good answer to that. I don't think we'd like to build a working class movement which will counter it in some ways, but people like us aren't going to build that movement. So, what is, if neoliberalism is either still around, or, as my friend Gary Gerstle wrote in a, I think, very good book, Rise and Fall of the Neoliberal Order, he thinks it's over, but he's not sure what's replacing it yet. Obviously, Gramsci's morbid symptoms are everywhere. But what politics? I mean, to me, any analysis of the problems going on has to be countered by, what are we going to do about it politically? What do we think should be done about it, at least? And how realistic is that? So that's my question for folks.
Sure. So I think, just to answer briefly the question that you asked, Pam, about Harvey's perspective, right? I think it's been a long time since I've read Harvey on neoliberalism, but from what I recall, he interpreted it, or sort of read it, as a class offensive by the corporate class to sort of take power during the crisis of the 1970s, as a response to the crisis of the 1970s, and mainly saw it as kind of from a kind of top-down, class war kind of perspective that was organized mostly from above and then directed.
Sorry, Jamie,
downward.
I didn't mean to ask you how you differ from the theory. I just said that you have these categories of the planetary factory and then the mode of control and how they relate. You set it up as the relationship between politics and economics, what otherwise has been misunderstood as the market and the state. And I guess it brings to mind the way that Harvey tried to parse out also the regimes of accumulation and the administration of those regimes. So do you agree with that formulation, that the politics are an attempt to manage this thing called,
What I was saying is that seeing politics and economics as separate realms, right, of practice is itself an illusion, right? These are, seeing them as neutral realms of practice or administration, whole cloth or wholesale, is a fetishized way that the ruling class and intellectuals and mass culture at large sort of thinks about capitalist society and apprehends it and tries to act in it. So it's not, there's no conscious level at which the elites were sort of thinking in these terms. What I'm suggesting is that, in a sense, the ruling class and its intellectuals and its theories are always sort of chasing after practice. Crises happen, global, society-wide and way of life-shattering crises happen at a global scale, rooted in breakdowns in the capitalist mode of reproducing itself, mode of production. And that then prompts a scramble to figure out what the hell it all means and what to do about it. And the elites just improvise. The policymakers don't know what they're doing in these moments. They just literally, the central bank is just pouring money like a fire hose into the financial markets to keep the whole thing going and not collapsing. You know, they did it for like 10 years. They don't know what they're doing in these moments. But later on, after they experiment for a while, then like concepts and ideas sort of begin to come together, and they come up with like a new rationalization for what they were doing, right? It's like, oh, it was quantitative easing all along, or it was macroprudential regulation all along. Like, we figured it out, right? Until the next big great crisis comes along and smashes all of that away. And so what I was sort of getting at with the planetary factory is not something that they were thinking about, like at the level of conscious practice, but it was that the global system of the capitalist mode of production, such as it existed from roughly like the 90s up through maybe, let's say, just for convenience sake, like the first election of Trump, right? That is a symbolic sort of marker. When really the wheels sort of began to come off and the elites really began to sort of question what was happening, because clearly it was going wrong. That's when that whole apparatus began to come apart. And again, it's not something at the conscious level, but rather something that's happening at the level, I suppose, of the totality. Anyway, my question would be, what should Platypus have done differently over the last 20 years, right? It's been a project. It didn't achieve the awakening of the left, right? It didn't prompt a kind of society-wide interrogation of the millennial left's categories or understanding of what radical politics could be. So what should Platypus have done differently over the last decade and a half or so? That would be my question.
All right, a lot of things coming out of this. I'm going to try to answer some of Pam's questions because I've had the most time to think about those. So do let me know if I don't get to all of it or if I leave something out. I think that just as you guys point out that the Soviet Union failed to achieve its project and then regressed into something, the Keynesian liberals would make many of the same kinds of arguments. And for them, World War II would play the same role as World War I. It was the horrible thing, which yet was the opportunity for them to try their thing. They weren't quite able to try it. Then they were forced to defend in a regressed way. And then the concessions that they made caused their project to become further barbarized and dogmatized and to then come apart. They could tell a story about World War II that wouldn't be that different from the story that you would tell about World War I. And in that sense, Keynesianism never succeeded on its own terms as a project, and that's in part why it continuously comes up, because there are still many people who feel like that project was in some sense not complete. And it's something that continuously reasserts itself, which is why you can't get rid of it. Along those lines, I don't think that the Keynesian Fordist state created neoliberalism. I think that the Keynesians never succeeded in changing capitalism into something else. And they imagine themselves really to be doing that. So along those same lines, there would have to be something that could change this into something else. I'm not really seeing what that is. And I tend to be a little skeptical of arguments that we're coming into something very different now, because I see the left do that all the time. During COVID, people were saying this is the falling rate of profit and the revolution is going to happen because of the pandemic. And then post-2008, there were all these claims that there would be a new Bretton Woods. There were even heads of state talking openly about a new Bretton Woods. And then, what do you get? You get Colin Crouch writing The Strange Non-Death of Neoliberalism in 2011. One of the things that the left wants very badly is for there to be a new situation, because if there were a new situation, then the problems of the existing situation would have been in some way gotten rid of, transformed, or changed by that move into something new. And for that reason, there is this deep, deep libidinal desire to find something new in what is going on and to say, even if we can't act, even if we can't change anything, someone else is acting in a way that's changing things. But I'm more inclined to see continuity, and in particular, there are very few people making that argument now. That position that I just articulated is not at all the argument most people outside are making, nor would it be the argument most people inside are making. I might be the only person making it, as far as I know. And I would be glad to hear about other people also making it. As far as there was another part. I always do this when I try to do two parts. I stay in the first part and then the second part. There was something else you asked about.
What should we do?
What should we do? So we're intellectuals. We offer advice to people who do stuff. So in offering advice, we are not identical to the people who do stuff, but we have enough shared goals, shared values, shared objectives that we're able to enter into their way of thinking, enter into their situation intellectually, and give them advice which is actually relevant to where they are in some way, shape, or form. The trouble is if you don't have anyone to give any advice to, then you end up talking to yourself in front of a room full of maybe, 50, 100 people? That's what happens when you are someone who gives advice, but you don't have anyone to give advice to. And you guys often talk about this in terms of the lack of the party. Christians talk about it in terms of the lack of the church. Keynesians talk about it in terms of the lack of a type of state. There's a lack of something that would give meaning to much of what we're saying. And so we continuously find ourselves in a situation where we talk, but there's no one who listens who then does anything, because we're going through a period where human beings are losing the capacity to act, losing the ability to act together, losing the specific traits, the specific virtues, character traits that they would need to be able to enter into collective action. And because all of this is happening, who do you even give advice to? Very small numbers of people, maybe, and mostly the advice that you're giving is about how they might also be able to become intellectuals, which, how far does that go? Ultimately, if no one else in the society is acting, no one else, if even the elites are completely underneath a set of impersonal incentives, then you don't really have anybody to talk to. And in that kind of environment, it starts to seem like what the theory is doing is useless or pointless. But at least I can clarify the character of this situation for some number of you so that you can waste less time on stupid things. At least I can do that. And that is still giving advice to somebody. It's just not the advice I wish I was giving, because it's advice about how you as an individual can protect yourself from the incapacity of yourself and those around you.
Can I make a comment on that? If I could make a quick comment on that. Historically, left-wing intellectuals like us have actually, had people to talk to and work with. There are left-wing intellectuals in the unions, there are left-wing intellectuals in the environmental movement, left-wing intellectuals in the Black freedom movement. I think part of the problem that the left has now, and this I think has been true in many ways since the 70s, is that with some exceptions, people talk to themselves. They don't get involved in mass movements, because that would involve having to translate their discourse into understandings that the people in those movements will be able to work with. I'm not saying people shouldn't write theoretical works, of course, but I think it's not true that the only thing people like us can do is to tell what we think is the truth, and whoever picks up on it, great. If they don't pick up on it, too bad. But if we really think that the world is fucked up, then to explain why it's fucked up has to be done with people who can change that. Yes, students can change that. But it's not just students who can change that. And there are a lot of people who do that right now, who do that kind of work. Not just that kind of work, but so I'm not dismissing what you're saying. I think you're how should I say it? You're missing the potential for doing much more than you think is possible to do. At least that's how I understand what you're saying.
I'm sorry, I didn't want to. On that point, I would just ask, and this is a question I think for anybody Who's the audience? Who are the people out there that we can give advice to who can do something with that advice?
I mean, yep. People who work on local politics, people who are in labor unions or try to form labor unions. I mean, the whole range of people trying to form and who are involved in mass movements. They read, they think about, they try to explain the problems that they're facing. And if we can help them do that, I think it's imperative that we do that. Otherwise, we are just Brahmin leftists.
Can I just, sorry, just to respond to Jamie and maybe respond to this. Platypus is not giving anyone advice. Just as an organization, that's not what we're doing. There is this possibility, we think, that the historical consciousness of the attempts at trying to bring about socialism, the historical consciousness of Marxism, might serve a purpose, that it might find some purpose in the future. And that's what we've been trying to do over the last almost 20 years, trying to track time in a way that makes it intelligible, so that also the kind of repetition, regression that I was trying to mark out in my presentation, the kind of return of the New Deal yet again and yet again and yet again, can at least be seen by our students and our audience, so that they may try something else, or if they try something else and end up coming against the same obstacles, that they can at least recognize them for what they are with sober senses. So I would just say that.
Great. I think I want to open it to audience Q&A. Do we have someone who can...
Yeah, we have a microphone, but do you want to pick who you want to speak and we'll run the microphone?
Okay, I guess Danny. It's coming.
Thank you very much. So my question, I'm going to state it first and then try to link things together. What would it mean to think about the rise and fall of neoliberalism as a kind of freedom problem that was not really clarified? Like what maybe was missing that would allow us to think about that? And so starting with, I think, Pam, in your presentation, you brought up the Naomi Klein. And of course, that was like the first Platypus article I ever read. And it really did hit me at the time about, oh, is it freedom from the market or freedom to the market? That was very much like in the air at the time. And I bring that up because when you were giving your account of kind of neoliberalism, it was like kind of the prehistory leading into neoliberalism, you mentioned the emphasis, I think it was Marshall Burnham, that the problem with capitalism is it's not individual enough, okay? And so yes, in the period of, I'm going to say the Keynesian Fortress theory, I'm just going to use this language, maybe it will be dismissed as a non-necessary word, that was something that was built out of a response to what was considered the unfreedom prior, right? So you can think of the Four Freedoms talk. And then all of a sudden that form of freedom seemed to be unfreedom, and people revolted against that. And then into the neoliberal era, I think, Jamie, the first time I ever heard you speak was on the work critique panel many years ago. And I think about why work critique appealed to millennials. It was like, okay, how do we give a critique of, kind of the market that doesn't fall into this distribution argument, that we can say, oh, actually, we're for individualism. We're not falling into a kind of collectivism trap, but we're actually saying something about society in itself. Now, Ben, in a sense, you seem to say, no, we've had one unfreedom problem, and you might think this is uncharitable, but in a sense, you just casted the entire 20th century into a question of capital mobility. It doesn't matter if it was the Keynesian Fortress era, the neoliberal era, or whatever the hell the terrorists were yesterday, is just rejigging this kind of capital mobility. And so for me, again, to restate the question, it seems to be about what does it mean to clarify what kind of problem freedom is? Because to the degree that we don't, we kind of respond to one-sided views of unfreedom. And to what Pam was just saying about this feeling of repetition, we're back in the same kind of freedom loop or something, or death loop or something like that. So what is missing to clarify that and how to do it? So that's my question for that.
Sure. Yeah, so I think for me, the question of freedom is kind of related to some of the back and forth just a moment ago. Like, I think I would also disagree with the framing that it's about giving advice to other people, just because I think that the division between theory and practice is part of the strategy of domination that's sort of inherent to capitalist society, where it sets the people who do the mental labor over here and people who do manual labor over here. And that's part of how it stratifies the labor market and sort of divides the class, right? The working class against itself. And so I think part of the project, whatever kind of form of a potential project, would be like how to bring radical theory and practice back together. And at the moment, I think that concretely takes the form of a project of class formation or class recomposition. I think there's a lot of practical, class-based organizing work that has to be done that doesn't fall into the trap of localism, that still understands itself as part of a mass politics. I think that's part of the legacy of the sort of neo-socialist revival of the 2010s that we can hold on to, like that moment, the Millennial Left moment, if you like, was that it was a form of mass politics, right, such as it was. And right now, I think, we very often on the left circle around this problem of class consciousness. Like how do we get there? Like why it's the enigma that forever eludes like the tradition, right? Like going back over 100 years. And I just think there's like a logically and perhaps like socially prior problem of class composition that has to be done, where we have to get the different sections of this divided class organizing together in new ways, perhaps. Maybe it draws on the old institutions in certain ways, like the existing union landscape and the political institutions, but I mean, the political institutions and the existing part, the Democrats are looking pretty washed to me these days. So that's certainly, I think we would disagree on that particular point, Michael. I think that their fortunes rose and fall with the evolution of the political economic system and its sort of financialized form as that came together over the last 15 years as the kind of the party of responsible management of the post-2008 order. And now that order has exhausted itself and the party has no idea what to do. And I think that's sort of like the material basis that explains their just drift and inertia and sort of sociological, obsolescence. So that's kind of how I understand the theory and practice problem as it relates to the freedom question.
Yeah, I guess I fall back on the old, freedom to freedom for dichotomy, which it should not be a dichotomy, and people on the left, Democratic socialists at least, should not see it as a dichotomy. And that's true, I think, out there, in the world of the left, people want freedom of sexual preference, freedom of pronouns, freedom of to have an abortion, all kinds of individual freedoms, as the New Left, did. And they also want, a much larger welfare state, a more powerful labor movement, a more powerful environmental movement, and they want all those things. And in the United States, at least, there's historically been a problem there because most Americans are much more anti-statist than the left has been. I think in terms of the Democrats, they're at sea, and if they succeed in winning the midterms, it'll be because Trump has made a mess of the economy. But I think there are people like Sanders and AOC and others in the progressive wing who are trying to put together these two sides. But again, it's not easy because, as you know, one of the problems with the New Left, I was talking about it, and they didn't make this argument precisely enough, is that we, and I have to say we, did not really take class seriously. but not really take not just that, but working class people and their views seriously, which are often much more culturally conservative. Some of the Maoists I talked about, like the Progressive Labor Party, told us, don't listen to rock and roll, listen to country music. Don't wear your hair long, cut your hair short. Don't wear blue jeans, dress up nice. You know, I'm not sure they were right about that, but even then there was a sense that the economic needs and in some ways desires of a lot of working class people, you know, for a better life, for at the time for having unions, clashed with some of the things that people like me were saying and doing, especially people like me were saying and doing at places like Chicago, Harvard, Yale, Princeton, Berkeley, et cetera, where their kids could never hope to go, unless they got scholarships and were lucky. You know, that's how I said it. And so I don't, look, again, this is unpopular here, but in this country we have a two-party system. A third party on the left is always been a wonderful dream, and for a while the Socialist Party seemed like it was going to be that party more than 100 years ago, but no party since then has come close to being anything like a mass party. And if that's been true for the last 100 years, it's going to continue to be true for at least the rest of my lifetime, and probably most of yours as well. So, you know, the only alternative, unfortunately, is to work with the Democratic Party to change it. There's no alternative from my point of view. But that's, again, maybe unpopular here. But, you know, I want to change things before it gets too late.
Yeah, on this point, I would say that one of the ways I was more liberal when I was 22 is that I really was more predisposed to think that if people got certain things that they needed, that would unlock capacities, so it would allow them to live better, and it would set them free in a sense, because it would enable them to think about and judge what's good or bad. I don't believe that as much as I did when I was 22, and in that sense I have become less liberal. That's not to say that I'm absolutely certain that wouldn't go a long way. I think it would go a long way, but I'm less sure now than then that would be sufficient. And I think because I linked those things together at that time, to me it was very obvious that inequality was quite central to the problem. But if you move away from that liberal belief that getting people the things that they need to live better will allow them to be free, once you move away from that even a little bit, then equality becomes a much more fraught concept. And I think that there's still a lot going on here with equality that tends to get not dismissed, but maybe not given attention in the focus on freedom that tends to prevail in platypus milieus. Because I do think they're intimately related concepts, still very related and hard to completely divorce or separate from each other. The way you conceptualize freedom still has a lot to do with whether you think equality is important, and if so, how do you conceptualize it? The bit about advice, I think that advice is praxis if you have an audience, because if you have an audience, then your advice is potentially motivational, which means it is activity, it's part of activity, it drives activity, it's engaged deeply with activity. The theory-praxis problem is, for me, the problem of advice without an audience. If we lived in the 1400s, I could give advice to a prince, and then I would have something to do, but we don't have that either. There's no one to give the advice to, I think. Really no one. I don't think any of these elected officials, any of these union leaders are really capable of action in any kind of meaningful sense. And we could get into what it would mean to be able to act in a meaningful way. That might be something we would discuss now or perhaps later on or at another time. But I do think that we really do have a lack of capacity for action that has caused language to become meaningless and for people to develop a very casual attitude to words that used to be obviously incredibly important. When you tell somebody, you should do this, this is what you ought to do with your life, and you actually have some chance of getting them to do it, actually getting them to do it, and being part of the reason they become what they become, you are very, very, very careful in how you use such language. But because none of us actually thinks anymore that any of that language will have any kind of actual effect, we just throw these words around and we treat them in this flippant way. It's a symptom.
I still have no advice. But on the question of liberty, which I will not treat flippantly because there is nothing one can do about it today, but perhaps it's even more important to think about it deeply because there's nothing to do about it today. Reading Hayek, I was reading Hayek just before the panel, just, like, okay, what kind of liberal is Hayek? And it's a very tortured liberalism. You can tell that he's trying to return to ideas of the unleashing of the social potential of mankind. It's kind of global and utopian in that respect. But there's this limitation. There's a limitation on how he can talk about liberty. It's never a liberty to become a kind of Hegelian species being, self-transforming, uncovering new horizons. It's not that. So what he has is like the old liberalism of the liberalism against tyranny and coercion, and that he seems pretty disciplined about throughout his work. But something is lost, which I don't think is reducible to Hayek's bad ideas, but because that horizon of possibility of becoming transformative potential, right? So not the Cold War version of liberalism, of like the individual, right? Like possessive individualism, this kind of McPhersonite reading of John Locke, so not that, right? But what Platypus, what we learn in the reading group, this capacity to unleash the transformative capacities of man. Freedom from necessity, self-transforming activity. Hayek is tortured about it. So it's there and not there. It's there and not there and not possible. But it is what convinced me to be a Marxist, because I thought that there was something in that question of Marxism that tried to recover the utopian aspirations of that classical liberalism. But when Naomi Klein dismissed Hayek and Friedman, I mean, she said that these were just, the freedom, like ideology. Freedom was pure ideology. I think Ian Morrison at the time, I remember, said, well, we have to be careful about that because we don't want to cede the problem of freedom to the right. And when we walked into rooms that said that the way that you fight neoliberalism is by being on the side of the working class, and what that meant was being able to secure certain goods, then the freedom problem does drop out as well.
Yeah, thank you for your contributions and for the discussion. I want to stay on the topic of the freedom problem and of liberalism, and because it seems to me all of you, or especially Michael, Jamie, and Ben, you had your own implicit critiques of liberalism. Michael, you raised what I understood as a critique of the New Left as being, not focused enough on the aspect of exploitation, but rather, on the Marxist notion of commodity fetishism, but not enough, so to speak, on, what Ben, you would have described as inequality. And Jamie, you raised the problem of liberalism in the sense of a false fetishization of the market and the state as being separate spheres that can be treated as different, spheres of influence for politics. And Ben, if I understood you correctly, liberalism in that sense is actually, in its result, in its working out, an erosion of the possibility for acting. I mean, at least that was, to me, what, the difference between your 22-year-old self and your today old self seemed to suggest. So what I want to raise is what Pam, you just mentioned before, and that is Marxism. What about the Marxist critique of liberalism, and what about the Marxist critique of the state? what is the state according to Marxism, and do we need Marxism today to change the world at the end of neoliberalism?
I'm not a Marxist, and it's not just because I don't, want to tie myself to one body of thought, but also I think Marx was, was a great economist, a great philosopher, but he wasn't very good at understanding politics, I think. He'd like to, even in his most sophisticated works of history, Études Primaires, Classe of France, he still wanted to reduce politics to class categories, I think. I don't think that works because there's many other categories of politics they didn't take seriously enough, I think, like nationalism, like religion. I can go on, I won't. But, and just a word, for the liberal state. Liberal state, tried to humanize capitalism, and even poor Joe Biden, in his own way, is trying to humanize capitalism. I'm a socialist. I don't believe in the end you can humanize capitalism as much as it should be humanized. At the same time, every left, at least in the United States, and outside the communist countries, which no longer, except maybe North Korea, are communist in any real sense, not even there, have always had to sort of work with the liberal state in capitalist countries. First of all, to get legal, and then to try to work to get enough gains for working people within a capitalist society. And so the reason why I got my back up about what you were saying before is just because I think if Marxism is not useful in understanding how to act in the present and the future in such a way as to probably use a liberal state to actually undermine capitalism as much as possible, and at some point, maybe in the near future or distant future, to actually have some kind of revolution that can do away with capitalism. I'm not sure it's good for anything besides Marxists talking to the Marxists, which isn't all that interesting to me. Sorry.
So, Marxism is one of the great traditions in human thinking, and the great traditions in human thinking should never be thrown out. And one should always be interested in any of the great traditions in human thinking. As far as the role that Marxism plays for me here now, there is still this possibility that we might alienate certain capacities for the purposes of growing them and then regaining them at a later point. So we might say, okay, before capitalism, there was an insufficiently large surplus, and very intense scarcity limited greatly the number of people who were able to realize human capacities. The only way we seem to be able to expand this surplus such that we can generate greater capacity is to put people through a system which robs them individually of their human capacities and qualities. So to create more impersonal capacity, we have to debase particular people. We have to debase subjects. So the question then moves from, is there enough stuff, to do we have subjects who are still capable of using any of the stuff, no matter how much there is? And you can imagine a society with an infinite amount of stuff, but subjects that are completely unable to figure out how to use it, at the very, very extreme. Marxism retains this hope that despite the ways in which the subjects have been debased by the alienating process, they might yet nonetheless come to reappropriate the stuff that they have over the course of many generations and much toil and torment labored to produce. That idea, I think, can never be thrown into the dustbin of human history and never tossed out and never dismissed out of hand. It remains something we have to think about as a possibility. And insofar as we abandon it or give up hope on it, I do think, in a very meaningful sense, that would be completely giving up on the human, which I've not yet done, which is why I still talk to you.
I've got to leave to meet some people for dinner across town, but thanks very much for, listening.
Take care. Good to meet you. If I could just quickly on the question of the state. The state is the social form of the social relations of capitalism. I would argue that the Marxist tradition has the most robust critical theory of the state, as opposed to the various social theoretical alternatives. And particularly now, when we're going through this great period of state transformation, which I think is happening, we need more than ever, right, a kind of conceptual and theoretical apparatus that can help to contextualize that and embed that within a conceptual framework in which it makes sense historically and in which like ordinary people can relate to it and understand, oh yeah, this is why this is happening and this is how we got here. And I think for that you need a theory of the state that's neither the sort of impartial arbiter of social conflicting interests like you have sort of on one side of the liberal tradition, nor is it just the straightforward arm of capital, the executive committee of the bourgeoisie, which is also like actually like has roots in the liberal tradition as well, but is rather it is the form taken by the ever-evolving and transforming social relations of capitalist production.
I come at this position, or a question from the position of a 22-year-old Ben. So 11 years from now, I wonder if I'll be asking similar questions, but it has me thinking, this is a striking panel because in large part, it seems as though it's a conversation between people who, by and large, come from academic, intellectual upbringings, and it seems as though there's a very conscious relationship to the problem of the left from that position. And I wonder, in respect to the conversation raised by the title, What was Neoliberalism? Of course there's the state and the economy, but there's also changes in the way that intellectual production takes place, the neoliberal academy. And what I wonder is, in the imminent future, but also looking retrospectively, in what ways is the way in which intellectual activity, theory coming about, are the conditions for that going to change? How might the transformations that have taken place in the way that theory production happens be generative in their own right of the possibilities for left politics, or is it kind of solely dependent on higher order changes in just like the dynamics of the global economy or something like that?
So there's a kind of intellectual that has become increasingly dominant, and it's the engineer. The engineer is the one who gives advice now. And the engineer is the one that people respect, take seriously, and listen to, because the engineer's advice gets a result and actually motivates people to do things differently. Hobbes in Behemoth advised that we get rid of the old type of intellectual and that we gradually produce instead only people who are good at making things more efficient, at helping the king do what the king is looking to do. And now we have a company, Anduril, which is the sword of the king. It is the Behemoth company, right? This is, I think, the general trajectory of the academy. There's a question of, can you be more like an engineer? And if you can't be more like an engineer, what on earth are you for? And one of the things we have to do is articulate a what on earth we are for. To someone at least, because all of us who do any kind of intellectual work depend on the 4 Ps: parents, partners, patrons, and professional institutions. Nobody does any of this stuff by themselves, and if you try to do it by yourself, you end up a homeless person on the street, raving mad, unable to communicate with anybody, or locked up in a psychiatric ward. So you do have to find a way to legitimate the activity, and the crisis of the university system is, in that sense, a crisis of legitimation. It no longer seems like there's any need for the kind of intellectual that was once considered the dominant type of intellectual, with the professional, the lawyer, the doctor, the engineer, treated as a secondary, in-use, operational kind of intellectualism. That now is the dominant type, and it's not clear whether we do anything that is worth supporting. And this moment where the universities are being challenged directly by the administration is a moment where if the universities care to continue, they have to actually give an account. But they're not doing that. They say they shouldn't have to give an account to the barbarians. If you don't give an account of yourself to the barbarians, they'll string you up and kill you. The church was able to figure that out. Why are these people unable to figure it out? Maybe they've regressed beneath the level at which the church was able to operate at in the Dark Ages.
Well, I'd like to hear the other speakers' answers, but Ben, I'd just like to get a clarification from you. You say that it seems as though there's a crisis of the intellectual insofar as the demand is for them to become something more of an engineer. What brought that about?
Well, what brought that about is a lack of need to legitimate state power, a lack of need to protect the system in any way from a working class. Also, elites are not really engaged in regime competition now. They're not trying to replace one kind of regime with a different kind of regime. They talk this way, they write books called Regime Change or what have you, but they're not really in the business of contesting political system types. And this is the sense in which there hasn't really been a challenge to neoliberalism. If there was, then there would be a real need for us to either defend it or attack it. And our defenses and attacks would seem to have real force. They would seem to really matter. But that isn't really what's taking place. I think that for politics, for social theory, for all of these things to matter, there actually has to be a capacity to motivate. And in the absence of that capacity, it becomes curating a museum. And if no one is coming to the museum because nobody can afford to go to the museum anymore, then why should they keep the museum open?
Go ahead.
Yeah, I'll just try to be quick. I mean, I do think there is this, I would agree, or I would see a kind of exhaustion of new intellectual production happening in a way that that did arguably take place, at least speaking of a particular tradition that, we come out of, which is like, we could broadly call it kind of like the structuralist revolution in sort of critical social theory in the middle 20th century. That's followed by a kind of post-structuralist or postmodernist, right, aesthetic and theoretical response to that. And then after that, there hasn't really been as visible and as remarkable and broad, right, an intellectual evolution, right, that's sort of qualitatively different from that trajectory. And also, like, I don't work in the academy as a professor, so like I'm not as fully like up to date on the way that all of the disciplinary and arguments are unfolding in the different fields and whatnot, but that's my impression. And in general, I think it just has to do broadly, maybe I would agree with Benjamin's assessment here, there is kind of this figure of the engineer, like the technical optimizer, like a certain kind of intelligence is valued at a premium, I think because of the way that our society has evolved in this increasingly sort of savage and unequal direction. And the total upward concentration of social and political power that has occurred over the course of the last 50 years or so, combined with a total revolution in the media environment and the way that people consume information, which is like a completely different topic, right, that we could spend hours on. But I think the publics, right, that would otherwise be receptive to reading about theory or really just verbal literacy, right, is changing. And those publics and audiences aren't there as much anymore. And again, that's a broader problem that has to do with the way that the information environment has evolved over the last several decades, but I'll leave it there.
I'm not sure. I'm very suspicious of the intellectuals I don't know. It seems that sometimes things flare up and then ideas matter. Like this whole controversy around the 1619 Project, all of a sudden, I as an American historian, I was like, oh, like the American historians, they have something to say. But I don't know, I don't think definitely the conversation that we were having here in terms of historical consciousness and problems and like the role of intellectuals on the left is the same issue and problem as the sort of role of like academics or intellectuals today, right? So the intellectuals and academics and the turning out of new theory books about Marx and Marxism can very well and are, I think, an obstacle to the kind of historical consciousness that we'd like to preserve. So maybe those are two different questions.
Hi everyone, thank you so much for your remarks. So one could have, neoliberalism was a politicizing concept in the 2000s and the 2010s. And what's curious and what's in the description that was read out at the beginning of this panel is that as neoliberalism was going into crisis and changing, that the concept of neoliberalism became the basis on which a lot of people found their political trajectory or their political objection. I was thinking of 22-year-old Benjamin Studebaker, who was a year away from discovering Bernie Sanders, right? And which coincides with his graduation to Cambridge. So I want to ask 24-year-old Ben, I'd like to about how neoliberalism then became an actual political force in his heart or in his mind. Likewise with Jamie, and likewise with you, Pam, because you're there from kind of from the beginning. I think maybe with a particularly, I don't know, like learning about neoliberalism as it's being picked up by the left and refracted back to the 20th century. That's my question. So when were you politicized by the idea of neoliberalism? And how did it fall below, or maybe not, sorry, I'm putting words at your mouth, but how was it useful? And how has it remained useful or not become useful anymore?
24-year-old Ben, want to take a crack at that first?
I don't know exactly how to sit in a chair, which voice to use for 24-year-old Ben. I'm going to have 22-year-old Ben download an update. Oh, wow. Bernie Sanders. So I have to say, a lot of the people who get brought up when neoliberalism is discussed, like Naomi Klein or Wendy Brown, I don't read those people and don't care about them at all. They don't seem smart or interesting to me. I pay a little bit of attention to Nancy Fraser, but I'm not too into her either, to be honest with you. Most of the people that I read talk about stuff like the post-war trough, the point at which, in a particular country, it was the most equal economically that it ever was, and then specific economic reasons why it went away from that at that particular point. And it seems to me like a lot of people in America, where the schools aren't as good, are just throwing this word around to mean just anything with it, and they're using it to talk about a lot of cultural stuff that doesn't have anything to do with the economy. And so I thought that we were here to do something about the economy. You know, this is supposed to be the post-2008 thing, but these people are just going on and on and on about it as a fancy academic term to talk about processes of individualization and so on and so forth. You know, all of that could have been said about capitalism at any point. So for me, this wasn't really the word. It was a word that I knew other people used, and I could use it with them if they wanted me to, because I tried to talk to people on their terms. I think you still do. Yeah, I try. It's getting hard though. Yeah, I still do, but that's really what it was for me. It wasn't really the term that politicized me.
I would just say, I also wouldn't say it was the term that politicized me, but that it served, for a period of time, it served a useful function as kind of like a condensation symbol, or in the sort of populist political theory put forward by Ernesto Laclau and Chantal Mouffe and others of that school, right? You have the symbol that sort of condenses the antagonisms into one sort of image, which can then be associated with like a broader formation, and then that allows diverse constituencies with like radically different interests to potentially see themselves like reflected back in that opposition. And for a little while during like the Sanders run, neoliberalism kind of served that role of a larger unifying, like condensing symbol. And in that sense, I think it played an effective role. I mean, another form of this would have been the 99% versus the 1%, right? It's obviously not like sociologically or even economically adequate, but the point is that it organized a very wide array of interests and perspectives into a kind of unified, quasi-radical perspective for like close to a decade. And so I think it served a useful purpose there. I don't think it's useful anymore.
I was not politicized by the word. In the presentation, I was trying to convey how when we hosted these panels about neoliberalism, the way that the left spoke about it, it seems that people like Hillel Tickton and Harvey and others were emphasizing continuity rather than discontinuity. They were trying to warn the kids, right, because they were much older. They were from the kind of new left generation, and they were trying to warn the kids, this is not this new thing. You're still going to have to deal with the same problems of capitalism, except, as Walter Ben Michaels and other people said, except that this political formation is now sitting atop a defeated working class movement, and so you're going to have a harder time trying to make sense of it. And that seemed true. It felt true. But the flip side of that is that it was also, it seemed to be an entry point in a way that the anti-war movement wasn't, towards questions of the social relations of capital and labor and questions of Marxism, because most of what we encountered during the anti-war movement were either a sort of version of dishonest liberals, like you didn't really need Marx to argue for self-determination of the people or troops out now, and yet the Marxists were the ones that were organizing the anti-war movement. But people weren't really talking about the nature of capitalist society. They had sort of falsified Lenin and done some strange things to the Second International. But in Occupy, all of a sudden, all of these people didn't have answers to the instability of capitalism. And they couldn't find it in the Democratic Party, and they couldn't find it under Obama, and they couldn't find it anywhere else. And so Platypus thought, well, it was salutary to host these panels. And then what we found in the panels was that just the ghosts of the 19th and 20th century just like came in the room, right? So when Harvey's talking about the money form, he's saying that Marx was unfair to Proudhon, and Walter Byrne Michaels is bringing up the Second International, and there are these arguments about what should we do. And I think that at the time I thought I was a little annoyed at the level of conversation in those rooms. I was like, what is this? But now in retrospect, I think that they were quite rich conversations, and that the Millennial Left didn't know how to politically activate something that could take up those problems. But I guess I was trying to say that it did seem like in that post-Occupy period, it knew that the problem was so big that it couldn't resolve it just through the existing social democratic parties. And yet, somehow it falsified that particular insight, like very, very quickly. So I was able to see something in that moment. And, it's like haunts me.
I have a response for Michael that I want to pivot into a question for Ben. Michael characterized neoliberalism as individualism. I think there's always the risk that the left falls below the insights of liberals. So if a neoclassical economist like Deirdre McCloskey were here, she would point out that the neoliberal era was one in which billions were lifted out of poverty in the third world or global south. If a kind of foreign policy hawk, liberal, were here, they would point out that the sort of production of Apple products took place overwhelmingly, or at least very importantly, in a kind of collectivist authoritarian state regime, namely China, that was a big part of that story of the global south being lifted out of poverty in the neoliberal era. Right, so there's this individualism as selfishness story, that one can tell around like a whole earth catalog or something, but if one is looking at the broader picture of what's happening in neoliberalism, that doesn't quite seem to be fully the case. Also, if we look domestically, right, the coalition of unions and civil rights activists that Michael pointed to, supporting an ostensibly most social democratic program ever around the Democratic Party in 1968, about a decade later, it's my understanding many of them are involved in the creation of the Department of Education. And what is that doing, right? What is now not being done by the Department of Ed, now that it's been downsized? It's the enforcement of group rights, right? And again, if you read conservative liberals like Richard Hanania, Chris Rufo, the authors of the 1776 Commission Report in response to the 1619 Project, which Pam mentioned, they will point out precisely this, right? The way that the New Left took a long march through the institutions and remained fundamentally continuous with the Democratic Party going back to John C. Calhoun in terms of enforcing a vision specifically of group rights. You could call that capital letter democracy as well as small d democracy in a way that's very consistent with Marx. So, and of course the left supported the Chinese government as well. So I think to turn to Ben, this is maybe one reason why it's helpful to periodize different epochs in capitalism, right? Like if we want to use Burnham's terms, the circulation of elites, right? Rising and falling constituencies. In each era, the avowed left hitches itself to that process that's often aligned with the capitalist state in some way. And I think understanding that capitalism reproduces itself in and through petit bourgeois democracy of this nature, and that this happens in epochs and phases, and that each new cycle risks the integration of the left with that process, right? We saw this, for example, in just interviewing Batya and Sargon. Maybe J.D. Vance is the post-neoliberal new elite, the forgotten America, flyover America. Maybe that's the neglected socio-political constituency of the neoliberal era that the left now needs to get behind and support, right? So there could, I wonder if you would accept a limited case for the usefulness of these categories in the sense that it's helpful for the left to be cognizant of the ways in which it might be very drawn into what might be called elite circulation or rising and falling class and socio-political integration in successive epochs.
That was for you then.
I think you first.
Yeah, so I think that lots of different kinds of conceptual schemes can potentially be useful. It really depends on the case and depends on the use. So I often find myself in situations where people have very rigidly dogmatized schemas that they use to periodize very aggressively in a very hard kind of way. And often they use these schemas to say that anything that occurs outside of the period just fundamentally doesn't get the period, can't think like the period, has nothing to do with the period, so it becomes very hard and fast. So a lot of what I find myself doing lately is trying to talk across some of those hard barriers that people have put up, especially young people. Young people tend to put these hard barriers up so they don't have to read or think about people who come from times or places that are very much different from their own in various respects, or to put these places on the back burner. Maybe they say, okay, I'll get to that, but maybe when I retire, or maybe in grad school, or maybe, and then they never read any of it. And then when they are confronted with any of this stuff, the periodization becomes a protective carapace. You go, no, it doesn't matter I don't know that. It doesn't matter I haven't read that guy, because he's from a different time, he doesn't matter. So that's why I tend to problematize that. But of course, if we are careful, and we recognize that we're only doing this in an operational way, and not for the purposes of excluding, then different kinds of terminological frameworks can, of course, be useful to get at specific dynamics or specific things that we think had a beginning and an end. So that would be my qualified endorsement of thinking in terms of those kinds of concepts.
Just to very briefly respond, I guess what I'm pointing to, Ben, is like one thing that I appreciate about your work and your thought is that you're very sensitive to the way in which leftists can get trapped into what might be called capitalist culture wars, right? Like no, we have to support the professional women and people of color versus the native-born like white male working class or something. Or no, actually we need to promote natalism among the native-born white working class, and there's been too much emphasis on the legally protected classes, right? Like you're sort of sensitive to the way in which these become traps for the left. And I guess just what I'm pointing to is that in periodizing capitalism, one can actually understand that problem historically. Right.
I do use some periodizations myself. In some of my talks, I'll do an early capitalism, middle capitalism, late capitalism distinction. So I'm certainly not against periodizing. It just depends on how hard you take the categories and on the sensitivity, the context in which they're being used. So I am open to a case that some limited use, and indeed when I was in the conversations with people back in the 10s, I would use the word neoliberalism with them. I wouldn't go, you shouldn't use the word neoliberalism, because that would be self-defeating and a stupid thing to say and do. Instead, what I would do is I would try to take up the concept in a way that I felt was most helpful. So I would tend to tack it back toward capital mobility, free trade, deregulation, discrete economic phenomena. And if they wanted to use it to talk about some other kind of bullshit, I would go, you have to tie it back into those things. Or in my view, you're talking about something mushy in a confused and stupid way.
Okay, so Jamie has to leave, so I'd like to take a final question and closing remarks from the panelists. Still looking there. Sure. Who's in the yellow shirt? Raising his hand for a while.
Yes, thank you very much for taking my question. I was about to ask about Technofeudalism by Yanis Varoufakis, since that seemingly has gained some traction over the past few days. And given the topic neoliberalism, I would just like to ask, how does the Varoufakis' Technofeudalism thesis change that in any way, or is affected by it?
Just quickly, I'll say I haven't read Varoufakis. I know he has a whole book on it. I haven't read it, but just from the level of familiarity I have with the theory, I think it does get at something real about the transformation of economic power into this sort of purely rentierist kind of direction and control over intellectual property and tech platforms and the way this capital is now circulating through those in new and remarkable levels of scale. And there's definitely the sort of Silicon Valley psychos who are sort of taking over the state right now, or are trying to. They definitely have a vision for AI as this kind of overarching, literally like a deity, controlling the flows of data and information and outsourcing them, on a cost basis. basically charging other people to use it across the whole society, civil society and state. And in that sense, he gets at something real, I think, Varoufakis, with this theory. But at the end of the day, as far as I understand it, it's about the kind of, his argument is that the extraction of surplus value as the kind of motor of capitalism, as a mode of production, is no longer like the dominant feature, and instead it's more characterized, or it's more defined by these new techno-feudalist institutions or organizations. And just to put it briefly, I would argue very forcefully against that. I mean, I think there's an enormous global workforce that is still exploited to produce the value that moves through the supply chains of the global economy, that circulates value through those supply chains, that then gets delivered into different forms in different parts of the world. And so, again, I could be not sure exactly if he would disagree with that or not, but as far as I understand it, I think he and I would disagree about that.
I would disagree with the fact that it's seemingly a new phenomenon with AI, as this theory has been around for longer than 10 years. It's been around that even before Varoufakis's writings even brought up.
Right, I was saying AI is like reinforcing its plausibility.
All right.
I on that point, I just want to say I very much dislike technofeudalism as a term. Very much dislike it. I think, for one, it exploits the lack of knowledge and understanding people have of the Middle Ages. And for two, insofar as feudalism was a thing, it was personal rule, personal ties, personal connections. Technology, AI, automation works impersonally. It has much more in common with Hobbes's corporate stage than it does anything medieval or feudal. So I think the language is extremely poor. And the language is so poor, it prejudices me against all of it, because the language screams, I know nothing about the Middle Ages, but we'll talk about it anyway. What else does he know nothing about, but we'll talk about anyway? What else will he abuse? And maybe I won't know in those other areas that I'm being taken for a ride. How else will I be deceived by such a person who would use such a term in the cover of the book? Anybody can say things have changed in some fundamental, profound way and invent a buzzword to get people to read a book. It's a very effective way to sell a book, but it's not a good way to help people see what's going on. So it very much bothers me, and a better book on this kind of topic would be something like David Runciman's The Handover from 2023, in which he makes the case that AI is an artificial agent in the tradition of corporations and modern states.
I think for Pam specifically, I would just like to ask, how does this state, what does it say that this new statement is now brought up in a time of neoliberalism's decline?
People want it to mean something. They want there to be something else that's going on. Middle capitalism really frustrates people because it's big and vast and it goes on and on and on. And there are always things changing in middle capitalism, but never enough. Never fast enough for it to mean anything for you. And so there's always a market for this kind of thing. Always a market for it. But one of the marks of a real intellectual is to not exploit such things and not take advantage of the reader in that kind of way.
I have a very cynical response, which is that in the absence of the political agency of a working class fighting against capitalism, the intellectuals will find all sorts of pseudo-sophisticated ways to describe the changes within capital, which are not necessarily useful, at least not for our purposes.